One of the concepts that we learned about when we talked about characteristics of life was the concept of homeostasis. All living things are homeostatic, meaning all living things must maintain a stable internal environment. That's accomplished through three parts of what is called the homeostatic loop: a receptor, which takes in data; a control center, which then interprets the data sent to it by the receptor; and then an effector, which does something about problems with the data. There are two types of homeostatic loops. One of those types is a negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop reverses a change in a controlled condition. What that means is that, for instance, in this particular example, it's showing you the idea of blood sugar. You need a certain amount of sugar in your blood at all times. Too high, that's a problem. Too low, and that's also a problem. The pancreas in this case takes the place of both receptor and control center. In other words, as blood flows through the pancreas, it acts as a receptor in that it senses how much sugar is in the blood. Let's say that that is a high amount. It tells the control center, which in this case, again, is also the pancreas. So there's a certain amount of sugar in the blood, and it knows that it's too high. The effector in this case, what does something about the situation, is the insulin produced by the pancreas. The insulin causes the extra sugar in the blood to be stored in tissue cells and specifically within the liver, thus lowering the amount of sugar in the blood. In other words, it reversed a change. The sugar was too high, so it reduced some of it. The flip side of that, what if the sugar is too low? So the pancreas, again, acting as the receptor, takes in the data of how much sugar is in the blood. Acting as the control center, it knows the level of sugar in the blood is too low, and so it produces a different hormone this time to act as the effector. This time it's called glucagon, which takes some of that sugar that was stored in the liver and releases it back into the blood, again reversing the change. The sugar was too low, so it raised it. A negative feedback loop, which is very common, acts differently than what's called a positive feedback loop. Instead of reversing a change, as was the case with a negative feedback loop, a positive feedback loop enhances a change. The classic example of a positive feedback loop would be childbirth. You can see the picture of the baby here, and the head pointed down towards the woman's cervix. There are nerves within that cervix which act as the receptor in this particular homeostatic loop. They sense pressure from the baby's head. Those nerves are going to send that information to the brain, which acts as the control center. It knows the pressure means that birth is ready to occur. So the brain produces something called oxytocin, which causes muscle contractions within the uterus. The oxytocin is going to act as the effector in this case. So as the uterine muscle contracts, basically it squeezes, and therefore squeezes the baby downward. That, of course, causes more pressure on the cervix, which is sent to the brain, which therefore produces more oxytocin, which causes a greater muscle contraction, which forces the baby down even further, and this loop just continues and continues and continues, enhancing the change. The initial change was pressure, and with every squeeze of the uterine wall, that pressure gets greater and greater and greater. So it does not reverse the change, it enhances it. Of course, eventually, the baby will be born, and that completely eliminates the controlled condition of pressure on the cervix, and the whole loop stops. So unlike negative feedback loops, which just continue and continue and continue, there's more of a start and end point in positive feedback loops. We talk homeostasis at this point because we're now talking about cells. And since all living things are made of cells, and each cell in you is by itself essentially a living thing, homeostasis must be maintained within the cells. And that is frequently accomplished by things going into and out of the cell that are necessary for the cell to maintain that level of homeostasis. That will lead us to the topic of cell transport.